Thank you so much for those introductions, and thank you everyone for joining us here today for this fantastic program organized by Asia Society Museum and Sharjah Biennial 16, exploring transdisciplinary collaborations and indigeneity across Asia and its diasporas. And I'm honored to be moderating this introductory discussion with Hoor Al Qasimi and Yasufumi Nakamori, titled Reworlding Institutional Practice, which explores how Asia is being redefined through art. So in the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about the task of redefining the form and function of the arts and cultural institution in the 21st century, in response to evolving conceptions of the global, and within that, the redefinition of regions within the global context, and of course, the role of art and culture in that reworlding. And of course, we're also coming at this from the perspective of institutional practice, and both Yasufumi and Hoor have incredible experience working across regions, working transculturally. So we're just gonna dive right in. There's gonna be a slideshow that's just gonna be on a loop, so there'll be captions as well, right? Okay, great. So with that in mind, I'm going to open the conversation with a question about the very idea of geography as an institutional mandate. So Yasufumi, of course, Asia Society has a clear mandate, quote, to navigate shared futures for Asia and the world across policy, arts and culture, education, sustainability, business and technology, unquote. But it's also a trans-global institution with museum sites in Hong Kong, Houston and New York, and offices in Los Angeles, Manila, Melbourne, Mumbai, the list goes on. And Hoor, aside from Sharjah Art Foundation, which has long been a central site of research, gathering and exhibition making and collaboration within and beyond the so-called Global South, with Sharjah Biennial being 16 being a case in point, and of course with your own curatorial practice with Lahore Biennial and Aichi coming up in 2025. You're also leading the development of the Global Studies University in Sharjah, which was recently announced in September 23, and will consist of the College of African Studies and Africa Institute, College of Asian Studies and Asia Institute, and the College of European Studies and Europe Institute. And I think you mentioned Oceania as well. So with that said, as leaders of institutions creating transnational, transgeographical, and transcultural connections through the realm of art, how are you thinking about the idea of what constitutes a region when a region like Asia is heterogeneous, it's a heterogeneous geography and cultural identity that extends beyond its territory through its diasporas, and how is this informing your practice? So we're going to set the terms, basically. We know that the terminologies that we have for regions, for example, the Middle East, come with their own loaded histories. They're always evolving. So I'd love to know how you're thinking through this idea of geography as a mandate for an institution.
So may I start? Okay, thank you. A great question. We actually, I think, 15 location organization headquartered here in New York. You're right, we have 3 museums, New York, Houston, and Hong Kong. I actually look at Asia in the broadest and most expansive sense. Of course, including Western Central Asia, really kind of covering Asia Pacific. As a matter of fact, we have exhibition coming up looking at the bog painting tradition in Yukala in Northern Territory in Australia. Then we had an exhibition of the Iran modernism years ago. So we look at it broadly. As a matter of fact, title of our modern contemporary curators changed recently to include Asian diaspora. So curator of Asian and Asian diaspora art. We are really looking carefully into Asia, particularly Asian population communities in other continents, Africa, Latin America in particular, in our programming moving forward. I often think this imagination. Of course, Ben Anderson's 80s book, Imagined Community. I mean, the context of that was redefining nationalism and nation, which, we don't really look at it anymore. However, the power of images, printed media, digital media, how that could enable people to feel they're united, right? Asia is in a way, social constructed community, and the people who feel, they're part of it. Doesn't matter where they are, whether they're Asian or Latin American. If they feel they're part of the Asia, construct, then I want to include them as not only as an audience, but also subject of our studies, investigation. So that's actually how I am shifting a little bit in terms of remit of Asia.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, before I start, I just want to say something. I know all of us here are here but not here. Our minds and hearts are with the people who are suffering in Palestine and the ongoing genocide that is taking place. Of course, it's important to think of the genocides in Congo and Sudan and Kashmir and other places, the history of the Armenian genocide. These are all ongoing things, and this is why our platforms are important. This is why our voices are important, and this is why we're here to speak up for people who don't have the platform to speak. I just want to applaud all the students who are taking up encampments for diversity. To take up encampments to call for divestment. I think if we learned anything from apartheid in South Africa, it's about how important boycotts are, and these are peaceful protests. They are not violent protests. We need to basically stick together, be here in solidarity, and really hope for a free Palestine and the end of this long occupation. So I just wanted to say that before I start. And in answering your question, it is also this idea of what consists of Asia and all of us coming together. Like you mentioned, the term Middle East is a loaded term. My father absolutely hates the term Middle East. He refuses to hear it or to use it. So I think for us, it's really important to think of our geographies. I'll give you an example of one project that we did, which was a curator in residence that I was thinking of for the longest period. Oh, sorry, can you hear me? Carol? Is that Carol? Oh, hi. Now, is that better? Okay. Okay, I hope you heard my introduction. Okay. An example is this curator in residence program that I put together, and I realized that if people would come to find artists from the UAE, we have few artists, but to have a program that is more diverse or interesting, who do you include? Maybe it's regional, but what is our region? We're always being boxed in Arab art, Middle East, North Africa. So I decided, it was a long shot, but it worked. I decided to contact the local airline company called Air Arabia, and I used their flight map, which was a budget airline, so they have limited journeys, but now they have hubs, so it's expanding. And I decided to really think of maybe defining a region through this flight map. And asked them to sponsor it, which they did. So we stopped during the pandemic. We're hoping to bring that back up again. But we're always questioning what our region is. Growing up in the UAE, where half the population is South Asian, and many of the people are from also Indonesia, Philippines. You're always brought up in a very multicultural society. And then going to study in the UK and seeing that there weren't spaces like us. I wasn't represented in the art world. And I realized there was something missing. And maybe somewhere like Sharjah Biennial can provide it. And when I came back to Sharjah, the Biennial, people think that I founded the Biennial, but that's not true. I was 13. But I took over when I was 22. But it was very much categorized by country representation. And I found that really problematic because I thought nobody's from one country anymore. Everybody has, mixed lineage, mixed heritage, parents from different places, they belong to different places, refugees. So I decided that it is important to break down all these geographical barriers and just look at each other as artists, as individuals, and you find so many more overlaps when that happens.
Thank you, both of you, for that. I mean, it's so interesting because listening to you speak, I was thinking about how when we were working at IBRAS, we always said that we were intending to drop our tagline of being about visual culture from North Africa, in and around North Africa and the Middle East. But also the way that we looked at it, we were just coming at it from a different point of gravity. And I always remember Arik Chen, who was formerly at M+, used to talk about that with Hong Kong, that M+ sort of looks at its position as kind of coming from Hong Kong and then looking out to the world from this vantage point, right? So it's a very different way of thinking about how an institution is defined by a regional framework. And then I was sort of thinking also about Swana, which is a new terminology that's come out, right? We used to have MENA, Manasa, and so Swana, and I went onto the Swana Alliance website, and they did make a note that while it's a decolonial word for Southwest Asia, North African region in place of Middle Eastern, Near Eastern, Arab world, or Islamic world that have colonial, Eurocentric, and Orientalist origins, and are created to conflate, contain, and I'm quoting Swana Alliance, and dehumanize communities of the region. They are not thinking about this term as a way to create a singular body, but to find a framework to be rooted together in difference. And I think, Yasufumi, you had mentioned sort of looking at relationships between Asia and Africa, and of course this brings into the framework the legacies of the 20th century and Afro-Asian solidarities that we saw with the Bandung Conference and the non-aligned movement, for instance. So with that in mind, I want to think about the task of creating institutional frameworks that engage with, expand, uncover interconnections across geographies, cultures, disciplines, and histories, which is something that connects both your practices. But in thinking about this, whether it's drawing on the historical connections between Africa and Asia, creating connections with indigenous cultures within Asia and beyond, could you talk about how you're navigating your institutions towards, or go a little bit deeper, into mediating transcultural connections in the present without falling into the trap of homogenization? And I think this relates also to another term, West Asia, in which Palestine is part. How do you find these common threads and mediate commonalities while maintaining differences? And what does it mean today, the work and the function of an art and cultural institution that is seeking connections through the regional kind of frame of mind rather than the framing itself?
I think there's one clear distinction between your journey and my journey is that, I have been working at institution. So for the past, 16 years, I was a museum curator and now a director. I was in a way institutionalized, and I was in the US, first in Houston, and then Minneapolis, and I was in London for the last 5 years, but always with the museums. They have a, rigid, actually, rules and procedures and, institutional objectives, right? Those are things, I found not necessarily constraints, but sort of like a limitation in a way that I have to be creative within that limit. So and now, I'm in a slightly different institution where, it is a constellation of centers and museums, and part of us are also in Asia, although we are headquartered in New York. So, yes, I will speak loud. I'm sorry, I do speak softly.
We're very soft-spoken here.
Yeah, we are, indeed. We are not like typical New Yorkers, right? We're not Americans either, so, but I will speak clearly, yes. So, that's a really important to kind of construct a new framework to talk about the Asia in relation to art and culture. So one of our experiments was actually doing a triennial. That was a very ambitious project for us. I think actually we show like 30 artists. They come from, kind of everywhere, as a matter of fact. Including someone like Hamra Abbas, born in Kuwait and living in Lahore and Boston, to Reza Aramesh, Iranian artist based in London. We had some actually Asian artists who were born in Africa in that exhibition. So I wanted to continue that way of defining and redefining artists from Asia or artists in Asia. So one framework I'm going to bring in, it's really in partnership with Professor John Key, noted scholar of modern art, global art. In her book, you haven't read it, you need to read it, Geometrics of Afro-Asia. She's looking at actually history of art from, with the assumptions of a global majority, meaning Asians are, and Latin Americans, Latinos, we are, a global majorities. And then she's looking at the understudied connection between Black and Asian artists. So, when I say Black artists, including African American artists, and also, African diaspora artists elsewhere, their connection with the Asian diaspora artists, throughout the world. And she's really kind of finding the dots and also angles and then trajectories, basically. She's speaking of this very complicated relationship with a language of geometries. So how can I work with her concept and bring this idea into the museum space? That's one thing I am going to do. And then, very importantly, we're gonna also pursue this Indigenous Asia project. Of course, Adriano Pedrosa, fantastic curator at the MASPI in Sao Paulo, he did a show called Indigenous Histories. And I realized that by looking at the show, reading catalogs, he left out Asia. So that's a vast, actually, area of indigeneity, we want to look at. And as a matter of fact, at Asia Society Museum, we created more than 250 exhibitions over the last 55 years. And we've done 2 shows looking at the Australian Aboriginal art, 1986, Dreamings, and 2002, the native land, I'm sorry, there's another, yes. So we are going to do a 3rd exhibition of Aboriginal material in autumn, Madayan, looking at one particular community in Northern Territory, Yukala, their bark painting making practice will be shown in exhibition. So we have actually a foundation to look at the vast Asia and indigeneity. So those are the 2 areas I wanted to pursue in particular. And that's, in a way, in response to part of your questions, Stephanie.
I have an example for how basically the Africa Institute started. So in 1976, there was a hall in Sharjah that was inaugurated called Africa Hall, which housed all the cultural events in the region. I didn't understand why we grew up with a hall called Africa Hall when we had people like Mahmoud Darwish and Nazar Qabbani speaking there, but it was an iconic place. And the inaugural lecture at Africa Hall was on African-Arab, Pan-Arab and African solidarity. It was on African-Arab solidarity and also taking in its main core the issue of Palestine. This conference was organized by my father, and they were rebuilding the new Africa Hall. So in doing research of what Africa Hall stood for, 40 years later, we thought it would be a great idea to establish the Africa Institute, but to look at African diaspora studies. The original conference was attended by someone from the African Studies Association Journal. And when we read the report, it said that there was a recommendation for an institute. But we thought, taking into consideration what it meant in the 70s and what it means now, to have an institute on African diaspora studies, and also for us to think from our geographies what needs to be addressed. It's about speaking on issues in an equal platform. There are no hierarchies. We collaborate with institutions on the continent. And then when I was working on the Lahore Biennial, I started planning the Asia Institute because I found that a lot of the research I was doing made complete sense for our location, also in the UAE. So we haven't officially launched the Asia Institute. It'll be very soon, but we've been working towards it. Our first project with the Africa Institute and Duke University Press was the Monsoon Journal, looking at the Indian Ocean. So that's kind of a smooth transition to the Asia Institute.
Right, of course, and the Indian Ocean being such a great connector, right? Which sort of reminds me of Elisabetta Hetta, who's showing at Ocean Space right now in Venice, when she was talking about the Pacific being a connector, and that the world is so much bigger, and it's about the conversations happening within them. But I'd love to ask you about the European Institute. Thinking about, both of you have mentioned the diaspora, and there is a sort of post-colonial, or I guess what R.F. Jolik would call a colonial modernity, that has sort of evolved into a global modernity of the present. And, what we have then are, as you both said, people who basically embody multiple worlds at once, right? And thinking about Zineb Sedira with her work at the Venice Pavilion in the previous edition for the French Pavilion, she was talking a lot about how there was a very strong solidarity between Italian and Algerian filmmakers in post-independence Algeria in the context of militant cinema. So I'd just love to ask a little bit about the European Institute, and because I think this also comes back to the question of, what does it really mean to be an institution in the 21st century that deals with regions, right? And, for example, at the moment now, we say the so-called Global South because that term has had its moment, right? And in the end, there's always a problem that evolves. But at the same time, as we have seen in the 20th century, or even in the present, there are times when nationalism is necessary when it's part of an independence or a liberation movement. So it's very complicated. But I remember when we spoke before this conversation, and you mentioned the European Institute, and I think it's important to mention this, actually.
Yeah, so I was looking at old geographies, so like Institute of the Americas, Oceania, but there's a lot to do, and I'm taking my time. But I thought it was really important to include Europe in the conversation. It's not about not including Europe, because of course the history of Europe needs to be addressed and looked at from the other part of the world as well. And I think these are important conversations to have. So it's really, that's why all of these institutes have come under the umbrella. So people who know how I work is I work on a lot of projects and then build an umbrella to bring them all together. So the umbrella came later, which is the Global Studies University, which is now established as university. We're working on our accreditation to have students come for a master's and PhD. We already have fellowships and talks programs and exhibitions, but I think it's important to include Europe in the conversation for sure. I mean, it is the whole globe that we need to open up these conversations, and again, solidarity is at its core.
Yeah, absolutely. And Yasufumi, I think this connects to Asia Society's mandate. It's Asia and the world, but also in the context of America and the diaspora, as you've mentioned. You're basically, I guess with Yasufumi, what I'd be curious to ask you is how you mediate that as an institution that has key spaces in the US, for instance,
right.
And thinking about the politics of representation here, for example, the term AAPI, Asian American Pacific
right.
Islanders, and there's been a lot of talk about separating these terms, right? And creating space, but as the Asia Society, obviously, and you mentioned the Aboriginal painting show from Yirrkala. As an institution staging exhibitions, you'll have your exhibitions that present certain regions or certain histories, but at the same time, you're operating under the umbrella term.
Right. Yes. So, engaging Asian diaspora population in New York City, including Asian Americans, is increasingly important. And we haven't really returned to this space of Asian American art for a while, since we did Shoko the one way or another. It was a Margot Machida's exhibition, many years ago. So we want to offer, of course, art and programs, which relates to majority of our audience first. They are Americans often. We have a small number of actually tourists, and of course Asians who live in New York as well. I mean, my hope is that we wanted to become home for many of our audiences. It's important to reflect actually people who are coming to see our exhibition to feel they are part of the representation. So that's one thing, I take it very seriously. Going back to terminology, right? I mean, Hoor, you and I both, live in London, and we encountered this word called BAME. Remember this? Terrible. It's Black, Asian, minority ethnic. And I was like, I'm Japanese, and where do I belong?
Other.
Yes, others. So I think my 5 years was like a sense of alienation, although I had fantastic colleagues at work. But so I wonder if I could just kind of stay away from those, codification of, Asians and also others. How can we reimagine, Asian and Asian diaspora art and culture? And for those who are inspired by Asian and Asian diaspora art and culture, so I want my program to be very inclusive. So that's my plan.
Yeah, and I think that question, how can we reimagine, brings us very neatly to the question of reworlding.
Yes.
And I'm very conscious of time, so this is going to be my last question. I wonder, so, thinking about reworlding as an institutional practice, and I think what has emerged from this conversation is that terms that we use to define regions are always fluid, and they open and close, and they create points of departure or points of entry depending on how we use them. I wonder if you could talk about the most generative and challenging lessons that you've experienced through your work, through your respective arts and cultural institutions, through your personal practice, and how have these experiences informed your own practice of reworlding, or how would you, let's say, define, for the lack of a better word, describe, how would you describe the way that you approach the very idea of reworlding as a practice?
I think mine, well, I studied art, actually. I started as an artist, and the reason I took over this job is because I realized that there weren't spaces for people like us. I didn't see myself represented in exhibitions, in spaces 20 years ago. But I find that, 20 years later, you're still getting stereotyped, you're still getting racially categorized, you're still getting, you work really hard and the same journalist comes and says, oh, but you're not a democracy. And I said, well, if it's a democracy to send people to Rwanda, then there you go. Like, what is it? There are no more, what are these democracies that you talk about coming to speak to us from a point of, like you're coming from a higher position to tell us in the rest of the world that you're not good enough. And I kept saying, we're tired of Western institutions always telling us we're not good enough or we have to do things their way. Our audiences are from all over the world. Not everyone is the same. We have to think of our cultures and our audiences and create institutions that suit us. And not everything is written in stone. I think that's the difference with you coming from the institutional kind of programs of working in different museums, where I came across it as an artist and realized, you can make your own rules and you can work together and you can kind of try to break the mold as much as you can, but you only do it through common voices. And I still think there's a lot of work to do. I thought things were getting better, and then I was shocked at some of the questions that journalists would ask, and they were very racist questions and very racist comments. And it just makes you realize that there's still so much work to do. But now there's so many of us, and there's so many of us on the same kind of trajectory with similar experiences. And, together our voices are much louder. So I think we need to collaborate more and work together.
I agree, actually. The collaboration and also partnerships are the keys to have a bigger impact. So I'm very happy to have this dialogue here at this moment. I want to sort of like not necessarily resist market force, while respecting some of the finest research done, but we have to really kind of continue to advocate on primary language research, which is so important. Scholarly research, looking at the materialities, histories, local, global histories of art. I think those are very basic sort of like foundations of, art history. But we wanted to, really make art history plural. And I think for those objectives, I think we still have to do a really rigorous research, and also speaking with artists. And I want to look at actually museum space where we show art is, it's a primary space where everyone should have access to. I think access to art is, I think, human rights. And in particular, us, who are really working, on to promote actually, excavate artists from global south, we cannot forget that we have to continue to provide a great access to people to look at art and engage with the artist. That's my strategy. But it has to have a clear strategy and also objectives to do so. Because after all, it is map making, isn't it? It's a vast map. We are creating dots and connecting those dots. So, strategy, having a strategy in place, I think would be something I need to do. I'm into this job only 9 months, but I'm in that process right now.
So we are many, a great affirmation to end on, and make art history plural, which is a fantastic call to action. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us, and thank you to the audience for being with us. And I guess we're on to the next part of the program. Thank you.
Thank you.